When workers pried open a forgotten temple closet in 1966, they expected dust and scrolls, not a perfectly preserved woman, seated upright in silence, her face serene, her robes those of a Meiji-era noble. No name, no record. But sealed beside her were imperial seals, love letters, and a secret the government scrambled to bury. Whispers soon spread. This was the mummified lover of Emperor Taisho, hidden away for 40 years. But why preserve her body? And why erase her from history? Her name was Lady Teruhi, a courtier, a spiritual confidant, and, if rumours are true, the only woman Emperor Taisho ever truly trusted. Her disappearance in 1925 was never investigated. Her rediscovery, decades later, was quickly silenced. What happened between those years remains one of Japan's strangest imperial enigmas. Was she a victim of palace politics, or a willing participant in a hidden ritual the world wasn't meant to see? The story of Lady Teruhi doesn't end with her rediscovery. It deepens. In the months following the 1966 temple incident, a small circle of academics quietly began investigating the case, risking careers by following a trail of suppressed records, half-burned correspondence, and whispered testimony from aging courtiers. What emerged was not just the outline of a missing woman, but a pattern of silence, part of a larger machinery designed to erase anything that did not conform to the imperial image. The name Teruhi appears nowhere in official imperial rosters, but in private diaries from the Taisho court, particularly those of chamber women and junior attendants, there are repeated references to a Lady of Radiance, or Teruhi no Kimi in archaic honorific. Descriptions portray her as neither concubine nor servant, but something between, a woman permitted into the emperor's chambers at hours when no one else was allowed. She was described as calm, distant, and always smelling of cedar smoke. Some wrote that she chanted quietly to herself, even in sleep. What's most disturbing is how her disappearance mirrors an older pattern in Japanese history, where imperial shadow figures, especially women involved in spiritual rites, are deliberately removed from the record once their purpose is fulfilled. The Japanese court has long maintained a system of symbolic purification. In ancient times, even emperors would abdicate if they encountered death or spiritual impurity. Mediums were tolerated only while useful. Once they became inconvenient, they vanished. In Lady Teruhi's case, some researchers believe she wasn't just a healer or companion. She may have been what's known as a kamikakushi, or hidden god. In certain rural Shinto traditions, select individuals, usually women, were believed to house kami spirits temporarily. These people were revered, even worshipped, but once the spirit left, they were often secluded or destroyed to prevent spiritual imbalance. If Emperor Taisho believed Teruhi was such a vessel, he may have ordered her preservation to maintain a divine connection even after death. In this view, her mummification wasn't a violation of ritual, it was the ritual. One scholar from Kyoto University, Dr. Noriko Kamoshita, obtained photos of the artifacts found with the mummy before they were confiscated. In a private interview before her death in 1984, she described one letter written in a shaky imperial hand that read, "She carries my light. Until the fire returns, let her sleep in the cedar womb." Kamoshita was later pressured to retract her statements. Her book manuscript on the subject was never published. Her original notes were reportedly lost in a library fire in 1971. This pattern of erasure is not unique. Throughout Japanese history, women who wielded unusual influence, particularly spiritual, were routinely removed from the narrative. Princess Himiko, the 3rd century shaman queen of Yamatai, was once the centerpiece of early Japanese chronicles, then suddenly omitted from later imperial histories. Lady Kasuga, the powerful wet nurse and political manipulator of the Tokugawa era, was written out of official Edo records. Even in modern times, imperial figures like Prince Chichibu and Empress Taimei, both associated with unorthodox spiritual beliefs, were shrouded in silence. What does this tell us? That the Japanese imperial institution, despite its polished continuity, is constructed upon layers of controlled forgetting. The past is shaped not by what is remembered, but by what is permitted to survive the archive. Lady Teruhi may have once stood beside the emperor, perhaps even held his trust above all others, but her presence challenged the image of a modern, rational monarchy. A sickly ruler, guided by a mystical woman, could not fit the post-war narrative of order, strength, and divinity by lineage. So, she became a ghost. And yet, her image lingers. According to one local monk from the Gifu temple, strange events occurred after the mummy was removed. Monks reported dreams of a pale woman watching from doorways, or the smell of burnt incense drifting through sealed halls. One novice claimed he heard whispering in ancient court dialect, repeating the same phrase each night, "I was never meant to be forgotten." Whether these are tales of guilt, imagination, or something older, one thing is clear. Lady Teruhi has returned, if not in body, then in mystery. Then, in the decades following the mummy's quiet removal from the Gifu temple, the mystery of Lady Teruhi faded, almost. But ghosts, especially Imperial ones, do not rest so easily. Beginning in the early 2000s, her story began to resurface through underground academic circles, anonymous internet leaks, and rare interviews with aging monks who had once served at the now-closed temple. By 2013, a single grainy photo of the preserved woman, her mouth sealed with red thread and body wrapped in court-era fabric, appeared on an obscure Japanese blog. It went viral within hours, then vanished. But the damage was done. The public had seen her. The photo ignited a firestorm of speculation. Was she a lost imperial concubine? A spiritual medium sacrificed to preserve the emperor's soul? A victim of madness, locked away and preserved like a relic? Bloggers, journalists, and amateur historians tried to connect the dots. Conspiracy forums compared her case to other documented instances of state erasure. The term emperor's mummified lover began trending in Japanese forums, though always cautiously, anonymously, and in code, using euphemisms like the lady in cedar or Taisho's shadow. Official channels stayed silent. The Imperial Household Agency neither confirmed nor denied anything. Requests for records were met with bureaucratic dead ends, and yet former archivists, now retired, began to quietly admit, yes, there were documents, letters, medical orders, and imperial exceptions granted to unnamed women who lived within the court walls without titles. One such document, obtained through a university whistleblower, referenced an individual whose existence should remain untethered from reign or chronology. It became clear someone had been deliberately written out. But why? As academic pressure mounted, Japan's historical community found itself split. On one side, traditionalists warned against unearthing dangerous myths that could destabilize national memory. On the other, younger scholars argued for transparency, citing the need to examine how memory, history, and power intersect. One professor, Mieko Harada, wrote in her 2020 essay, The Cedar Veil, "When a nation polices its own memory, it does not forget, it performs forgetting, which is still more dangerous." But perhaps the most haunting part of Teruhi's resurgence was the emotional response. Young women across Japan began leaving offerings at closed temple gates, bundles of cedar, red thread, paper dolls. Online, digital art and poetry emerged, casting Teruhi as a symbol of silenced women in history. She became a stand-in for all those erased, ignored, or sacrificed to preserve an image of stability and purity. A viral poem read, "She bore light, not shame. She walked cedar halls while kings slept. Who remembers her name?" The irony was sharp. The very institution that erased her inadvertently birthed a folk icon. In 2022, a retired palace guard finally spoke. In a recorded interview, he claimed to have seen Teruhi once in 1925, walking with the emperor in the garden behind closed palace walls. "She didn't look like the others," he said. "She never bowed to him. She walked beside him." This statement, though unverifiable, caused a sensation. If true, it suggested she was not simply a companion, but a partner in the fullest, most forbidden sense. A once private tragedy was now a public mystery. A sealed life became a symbol of a broader cultural reckoning, with Japan's imperial past, with gendered erasure, with spiritual secrecy. Lady Teruhi, whoever she was, had become a reflection of all that Japan was not ready to confront. until now. What remained of Teruhi was no longer just a mummified body. By the mid-2020s, her physical preservation, wrapped in layers of embroidered silk, lips sealed with vermilion thread, limbs curled in fetal repose, had become a battleground for identity, meaning, and legacy. But the central question refused to go away. Why was she hidden for 40 years? Why did the palace never officially acknowledge her, yet also never allow her to be forgotten? Though her body was secretly removed from the Gifu temple sometime in the late 1960s, presumably to a sealed vault under the jurisdiction of the Imperial Household Agency, no official records confirm her current whereabouts. Speculative reports suggest she is kept in an underground archive known only to top-level custodians of Imperial relics, alongside objects deemed spiritually unstable or politically sensitive. Some sources refer to the chamber as Okura Shitsu, or the Storehouse of Shadows. A leaked 1989 memo, uncovered by a defunct tabloid, described the mummy as physically intact, spiritually neutralized. The language was unusual, more suited to an exorcism report than historical preservation. But for Japan's imperial system, where Shinto and state entwine, it made sense. Some believed Teruhi was not just mummified, she was ritually sealed. A living vessel for illness, prophecy, or scandal, she had to be spiritually quieted before death. Others whispered darker things, that her death was no accident, that she had foreseen something the state could not allow to be spoken. Meanwhile, spiritual practitioners began drawing eerie parallels between Teruhi and an obscure ritual in Heian-era court life, Hitogata no Mikado, in which an imperial female was chosen to carry the emperor's karmic burdens. She would live in seclusion, forbidden to speak her own name, treated both as lover and living talisman. After death, she would be preserved, not as a person, but as a sacred object, a containment. Could Teruhi have been one of these forgotten conduits, revived in the early 20th century for reasons we may never understand? A 2023 team of anthropologists, using facial reconstruction software based on the leaked photo, produced a composite image of what the woman may have looked like. The results stunned viewers. Her features bore an uncanny resemblance to several known courtesans of the Taisho era, but also to a famously undocumented portrait the emperor once sketched during his convalescence, hidden for decades, found only in 1995. The resemblance deepened the myth. Had he immortalized her in art before she was lost to history? Some wanted answers, others wanted peace. In 2024, a motion was quietly submitted to Japan's National Diet requesting a formal inquiry into historical suppression of individual identity related to imperial archives. It was denied without explanation. Even in death, Teruhi was too controversial to confront. Yet her impact grew. Artists created installations of cedar-lined rooms that pulsed with audio of whispered poems. Protesters in Tokyo wore red thread masks in silent demonstrations about state secrecy. A short animated film, The Woman in the Closet, was banned in one prefecture for potential insult to national harmony, and in university lecture halls, her story was taught not as fact or fiction, but as a mirror held to power. Was she a woman? A symbol? A spiritual device? The mummy could not answer, but its silence spoke volumes. A final twist arrived in late 2024, when a researcher noticed that a 1967 imperial budget listed transport of sacred object from Gifu to Kokyo under a non-public expenditures column. Kokyo refers to the Tokyo Imperial Palace. If accurate, this would place Teruhi's remains mere meters below the very institution that denied her name. And so, in a city of millions, she may still be there, beneath feet, beneath stone, beneath a nation's memory. Teruhi never intended to be a martyr. She was, by all surviving accounts, a real woman, deeply intelligent, trained in classical arts, fluent in poetry, and perhaps most fatally, loved by the wrong man. Yet by the 2020s, her image had evolved into something else entirely. She became a cipher, a national mirror, a symbol of everything Japan struggles to confront. The silence of its imperial past, the suppression of women's voices, and the lingering presence of the unspoken. In Tokyo's academic circles, scholars debated her significance without ever being able to confirm the full truth of her story. To the public, she was the woman in the closet, a title born from myth but grounded in enough fact to sting. The photograph of her mummified body, still unofficially verified, was not just proof of her existence. It was a wound, something preserved but never healed. Her silence accused no one directly, but it unsettled everyone. The nation's cultural memory has long been shaped by what is not said. The Japanese Imperial institution, still cloaked in constitutional ambiguity, rarely speaks of its private affairs. Deaths go unacknowledged, names are scrubbed, and yet these omissions form a living ghost map of the national psyche. Teruhi became one of its brightest and darkest coordinates. Throughout 2025, students marched in Kyoto and Sapporo, carrying placards that read, "Name her." Artists created immersive installations where visitors walked barefoot through black lacquered rooms filled with the scent of camphor and silk. In these installations, AI-generated voices recited poems attributed to the Taisho court, a blend of real verse and reconstructed memory. Visitors left weeping, disturbed not just by what they heard, but by how much they felt they already knew. In Nara, an experimental play premiered, The Emperor's Closet. It featured no dialogue, only a single woman kneeling on a tatami mat, slowly wrapping and unwrapping herself in red thread over the course of 2 hours. Some critics called it empty, others called it holy. Even in Parliament, whispers grew. Younger Diet members began pushing for archival transparency laws. A bill nicknamed the Teruhi Act aimed to declassify imperial documents after 50 years, instead of sealing them indefinitely. Predictably, it was struck down, but not without public backlash. For once, the ghosts had teeth. In a private interview, a retired Imperial Household Agency archivist hinted that there are at least 2 more women, similarly hidden in the records, neither mummified but similarly erased. When asked if any had children, he paused. "Some things," he said, "are removed not for shame, but for continuity." Was Teruhi silenced because she threatened succession, because she knew too much, or simply because she existed outside the system's invisible walls? In a society where every bow carries meaning, her very presence may have been too loud to ignore. In Buddhist cosmology, there is a concept called yurei, the restless spirit. These beings remain earthbound not out of vengeance, but because something was left unresolved. A name unsaid, a truth buried, a life without ritual completion. Perhaps Teruhi is not haunting Japan, but waiting to be remembered, not as a relic, but as a person. If the mummy still lies beneath the stone corridors of the Imperial Palace, it no longer matters whether the state admits it, because the public already has. Through art, protest, whispers, and weeping, Teruhi's story has escaped its closet. She now lives in the shared mythology of a country that claims to forget, but never really does. This wasn't just a love story, it was a burial in slow motion, and as Japan walks into the future, it must ask itself, what else has it sealed away? What truths lie behind its quietest doors? Because now the world is listening. History has many shelves. Some are gilded and celebrated. Others are hidden in dust-covered closets, locked, labelled, and left to be forgotten. Teruhi, if that was ever her name, never stood on a balcony, never gave an address, never rode in a gilded carriage. But she may have lived within the most powerful household in Japan, her story suspended in the shadows of ceremony. And even in death, especially in death, she remained unacknowledged, a body preserved in silence. Was she truly mummified? Did she live under a false identity, cloaked in secrecy, serving a throne that could not claim her? Or was she an invention born of whispers and grief, a myth to make sense of cruelty so quietly executed that even time itself refused to remember? The answer, perhaps, is not what matters most. What matters is the echo she leaves behind. In post-war Japan, silence became survival. For emperors, for bureaucrats, for women, especially for women, the state knew how to disappear what it could not reconcile. In Teruhi's case, the disappearance may have been physical, archival, spiritual, And yet the more tightly the door was shut, the more pressure built behind it. In the last decade, that pressure broke containment, not through confession but through art, leaked data, speculative fiction, and the persistence of people asking the wrong questions to the right institutions. She was never supposed to exist. That was the point. And now, that impossibility makes her more vivid, more real than a dozen state-sanctioned memoirs. Some call her the Velvet Ghost. Others say she was a concubine or a nursemaid, or even a fabricated stand-in for wartime atrocities the court could never admit. But, to a generation raised on silence, Taruhi is more than a woman. She is a cipher, a mirror, a stand-in for every voice hushed, every truth edited, every grief made impolite. She is what happens when a society refuses to mourn properly, when it turns closets into crypts and loyalty into annihilation. And still her legend spreads, not through official histories or textbooks, but through code, art, protest and dreams. There will be no royal statement, no memorial, no correction to the record. Taruhi's story, if left to institutions, would return to dust. But memory is not a privilege of the powerful. It belongs to those who refuse to forget. And in that refusal, a ghost becomes something more, an indictment, a legacy, a rebellion woven from quiet sorrow. When a woman is hidden for 40 years, we must ask, who hid her? Why? And what else was buried with her? The palace remains quiet, its doors remain closed. But outside its walls, her story is told in murals, screenplays, TikToks, scholarly essays, and ghost stories. Each retelling adds another thread, another refusal to let silence win. And someday, perhaps, the door will open. Until then, the Velvet Ghost waits, not to haunt, but to be seen. For 4 decades, her body lay hidden within the walls of the Imperial compound, not cremated, not buried, preserved. Was it grief that kept her above ground? Loyalty? Or was she silenced because of what her existence represented? An unapproved intimacy that risked contaminating the image of the chrysanthemum throne. In life, she may have held the emperor's gaze, but in death, she became a liability. A woman out of place, a body out of time. The decision to mummify her wasn't merely spiritual, it was political. She remained sealed in a small chamber, like a relic, like a secret. For 40 years, generations came and went. Wars ended, monarchs changed, Japan rebuilt itself into a modern nation, yet Teruhi remained, unspoken, unwritten, undisturbed, until, quietly, she was removed. No ceremony, no headline, just a clerical footnote. Her body was cremated finally, an act that closed the door on her existence, at least in the eyes of official memory. But even fire cannot erase what was once known, because now we are remembering her. Teruhi's story isn't just about one woman in a closet. It's about the machinery of forgetting, the ways in which a system can hide what it finds inconvenient. Love that defies hierarchy, women who get too close to sacred power, bodies that are meant to be invisible. She reminds us that what's written in history books is not the full record, only what survived the censors. And yet, she's not truly gone. Her presence lingers in fragmented notes, in oral histories, in the way attendants still avoid that section of the palace in hushed tones. She exists in the discomfort of those who recall her, and in the curiosity of those who dare to ask why she had to vanish in the first place. Some call her a mystic, others a mistress. Some say she was just a caretaker, but perhaps that's the point. We don't really know who Teruhi was, because we were never supposed to. In forgetting her, the system protected itself, but in remembering her, we uncover more than a name. We expose a fault line in the Imperial myth, that behind the robes and rituals there are real people, real love, real secrets, and sometimes real ghosts. August 15th, 1945. A divine voice emerges from a radio. Millions bow in silence as their god emperor admits defeat. But what if that voice didn't belong to him? What if the man who guided Japan out of World War II wasn't Hirohito, but a carefully trained imposter, a shadow, a double, sworn to serve and disappear. This is the hidden story of a body swap conspiracy so dangerous it was buried beneath decades of silence. Welcome to the Emperor's Double. Emperor Hirohito was born into divine blood, a living descendant of Amaterasu, the Shinto sun goddess. For centuries, Japan's emperors reigned from behind veils, never seen, never heard, but as World War II tore across the Pacific, that silence grew unbearable. The emperor became a symbol of devotion, of nationalism, of unquestionable command. And yet, behind palace walls, Hirohito was no ordinary despot. He was a marine biologist, a man of cautious temperament, who spent hours peering through microscopes even as Tokyo burned. He signed orders, yes, but rarely gave them. He was both present and absent, a paradox in human form. In the chaotic final days of the war, as cities were incinerated and nuclear fire devoured Hiroshima and Nagasaki, something strange happened. Hirohito vanished from view. For over 2 weeks, there were no photographs, no sightings, no public statements. And when he returned to read the surrender declaration, some whispered that he was different. His voice, unfamiliar. His posture, straighter. His jawline, his mannerisms, even his blinking patterns subtly altered. Some blamed stress. Others suspected the unthinkable, that the man who surrendered Japan was not Hirohito, but a stand-in, a double, trained in secret, sworn to die or live in his place. And while Japan rebuilt from the rubble, while MacArthur posed for cameras beside the newly humbled monarch, the real Hirohito, if he ever existed, was either dead, hidden, or watching from the shadows. In this episode, we dive into the body swap conspiracy that questions not just the identity of a man, but the foundation of modern Japan itself. Eyewitness accounts, declassified files, forensic image studies, and a trail of silence stretching from Hiroshima to the gates of the Imperial Palace. Was it national survival or an elaborate cover-up? The truth lies in what they refused to show. To understand the conspiracy, we must begin with the myth that Japan's emperor was not a man, but a god. For over 1,500 years, emperors were cloaked in divine mystery, said to descend from the sun goddess herself. Until the 20th century, they were rarely seen by commoners. Their voices were never heard. Even the imperial name was whispered, not spoken. Hirohito, the 124th emperor, inherited this sacred mask, but his life would shatter its illusion. Born in 1901 and raised in a controlled vacuum, Hirohito was trained in military command and marine biology with equal care. Though Japan stormed through Asia with increasing brutality, Hirohito remained isolated, both protected and imprisoned by layers of court protocol. His signature appeared on war decrees, but his speeches were written by others, his expressions measured to the point of opacity. By the 1930s, Japan had invaded Manchuria, withdrawn from the League of Nations and plunged into full war with China. Through it all, Hirohito remained distant, a divine figure atop an increasingly militarized machine. But some insiders claim that by 1940, something changed, because something had to. A growing network of wartime informants within the palace began recording inconsistencies. Hirohito appeared at a naval parade, but his gait was subtly altered, his tone lower, his hands no longer calloused from microscopy work. A servant wrote, "He watches us now like a stranger in his own body." Among the palace's most secretive areas were the O-Oku, forbidden quarters originally reserved for the emperor's concubines, now repurposed during wartime for intelligence briefings and medical isolation. It was here, some believe, that the double was first installed. Eyewitness accounts from a former lady-in-waiting, later silenced by the state, tell of two men dressed identically, rehearsing ceremonial bowing. One remained still as marble, the other blinked too often. There were two, she later wrote in a private diary seized by US occupation forces. Some argue this was simply rehearsal for Hirohito's highly formalized appearances. But what if one of the rehearsals became permanent? Photo analysis conducted decades later by forensic anthropologists revealed subtle but measurable differences in Hirohito's appearance between 1941 and 1945. The angle of the jaw shifted. The curvature of the earlobe varied. His posture stiffened, as if mimicking royalty rather than embodying it. Alone, these would be nothing, but taken together, they suggest an unsettling possibility. The emperor changed, physically and behaviourally, during a time when all cameras had been ordered away. In these same years, the emperor was seen less often in public. Official portraits were reused, paintings substituted for press photos. Even military leaders reportedly met with him through a silk screen. The rationale? To preserve divine distance. But perhaps the truth was simpler and more chilling. The man behind the curtain wasn't the god, just a man trained to be him. Could a mere human survive becoming a god in wartime and surrender as one after? And if not, what if another man did? It was the moment Japan shattered. 2 atomic bombs had reduced cities to ash. Millions were dead. The empire stood at the edge of annihilation. And in its highest chamber, the Imperial Palace, silence reigned. Between August 6th and August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito disappeared from public life. Not a single verified image, no speeches, no meetings. For 10 critical days, the living god of Japan became a ghost. The official story claims he was isolated, contemplating surrender. But internal palace documents, partially declassified decades later, hint at something stranger. One note, dated August the 10th, simply reads, Kote Kiyome. The emperor is not well. No medical file has ever been produced. No physician name, no record of treatment. Outside, US aircraft circled above Tokyo. Within, the palace went dark. Guards were doubled, entire wings were sealed. One interpreter recalled being told, "You will not see His Majesty until the sun rises on a new Japan." During this blackout, a radical event occurred. Japan's War Council, after months of refusal, agreed to surrender. But when the document was drafted, something peculiar stood out. The emperor's signature differed from every prior decree. Forensic handwriting experts today point to 3 anomalies: a tighter curl on the final kanji stroke, a steeper upward angle, and tremor lines inconsistent with Hirohito's previous precision. Nervousness? Perhaps. But another possibility lingers. This was not the same man. Palace insiders spoke of a shadow emperor present during these negotiations. One chamberlain later confessed under immunity that a second Hirohito rehearsed the speech multiple times before the recording. But the real emperor? He was absent, the aide said, physically or otherwise. Supporting this is the enigmatic suicide of General Korochika Anami on August 14th, the final voice against surrender. His death note read, "With my deepest regret, the Imperial House." Some believe he took his life not over surrender, but over betrayal. A body switch, even for peace, violated every code he swore to uphold. Then, on August 15th, at precisely noon, the Emperor's voice was heard for the first time in history. The broadcast was scratchy, distant, almost robotic. To many Japanese, it was difficult to understand, not just because of the archaic formal language, but because the voice was unfamiliar. One farmer said, "It did not sound like a man, it sounded like an actor pretending to be one." Historians claim this is reading too far into noise and grief, but linguists analysing the speech later found the pitch and cadence inconsistent with surviving recordings of Hirohito from later years. Could trauma change a voice so drastically? Maybe, but there is no known recording of his voice before August 1945, no baseline. The day before the speech, several US intelligence officers reported seeing a convoy leave the palace under cover of night. The vehicles were unmarked. The route led not toward the port, but deeper into the forests of Chichibu, west of Tokyo. The official record? Transport of ceremonial items. But what item requires 4 armed trucks? Whispers began among Japan's inner circle. The emperor had died. or been assassinated, or gone mad. What surfaced in his place, they claimed, was a trained double, coached to deliver surrender, then vanish again into silence. But what if the double didn't vanish? What if the man who emerged after Japan's fall, the man who reigned through the American occupation and lived into the 1980s, was never the original? What if Japan surrendered under a stranger? The Japan that surrendered in 1945 was not the Japan of tradition. Its gods had fallen silent, its military was humiliated, and at the centre of the storm stood a man, or a figure, whose presence raised more questions than comfort. On September 27, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur met Emperor Hirohito for the first time. The photograph became world famous, but in Japan, it sent tremors. Hirohito stood beside MacArthur like a schoolboy. No sword, no robe, no air of divinity. His hands hung stiff at his sides, his smile barely a twitch. To Western eyes, it was humility. To some Japanese, it was the face of a man pretending to remember who he was. From that moment on, Hirohito was remade, not just politically, but physically. No longer seen in military dress, he appeared in Western suits, walked among commoners, and recited scripted lines in awkward public tours. It was as if the emperor had been reborn, with none of the memories. Compare footage from 1940 to 1946. His walk, once assured, became mechanical. His gaze, once piercing, now darted nervously. And his voice? Those who served him before the war said it sounded different, softer, higher, occasionally pausing in the wrong places. One aide remarked, "He spoke Japanese, but it wasn't the emperor's Japanese." Some dismissed it as trauma, but others believe these were the learning curves of a double, carefully trained, coached, rehearsed to step into the most sacred role in Japan. Facial recognition analysis done decades later compared ear shape, nose width, and jawline proportions between pre- and post-war Hirohito images. The results were inconclusive, but one anomaly stood out. The man post-1945 had more asymmetry in his right eye fold and a faint scar not seen before. Surgery, age, or a different man altogether? American occupation records reveal an even more unsettling detail. In internal memos, SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, officials argued that preserving the emperor, or a figurehead resembling him, was essential to maintain social order. One 1946 report states, "The Japanese psyche depends on the appearance of continuity. Whether authentic or not, the image of the emperor must be preserved." Preserved, not protected. The post-war Hirohito became less of a leader, more of a ceremonial mannequin. He smiled at schoolchildren, he made appearances at factories, but he never again issued a decree from his own hand. Every message, every quote passed through layers of scriptwriters, handlers, and translators. Japanese scholars of the 1950s began to whisper. One noted in a personal letter, "This man is not the scholar king we knew. He is a ghost with a crown." Another, under pseudonym, called the emperor a mask worn by stability. Even more mysterious was Hirohito's near-total silence on the war in the decades that followed. He rarely spoke of his own wartime decisions. He refused to testify during Tokyo war crimes trials. And when asked directly about Japan's aggression, he offered only vague regrets. Never personal, never specific. Was this a calculated choice by a cautious man, or a strategy to avoid revealing a truth he didn't know? Some researchers point to American efforts during the occupation to erase or overwrite certain records. A number of palace personnel were quietly relocated. Several disappeared. One interpreter who worked with the emperor until 1945 was found dead in 1948, ruled a suicide, but the note he left read only, "Forgive the illusion." And then there's the final twist. In 1946, a former kabuki actor named Tadashi Iwamoto was quietly released from a secret US facility. His prior record, arrested in 1943 for impersonating a member of the Imperial family, with unsettling precision. His files, ears were sealed, then disappeared. Today, the official line remains, Hirohito reigned until his death in 1989, a peaceful symbol of a reborn nation. But the man who waved from balconies and spoke carefully crafted phrases, was he the same man who led Japan into war? Or was he the perfect replica of an emperor who, in the shadow of surrender, quietly vanished and was never seen again? The Japanese stage has always been a mirror. Kabuki, with its mesmerizing blend of drama, precision, and transformation, turns ordinary men into gods, generals, and emperors with terrifying ease. But what if the stage prepared more than just theatre? What if it rehearsed history itself? During World War II, kabuki actors were frequently conscripted, not into battle but into propaganda. Their role? To embody national figures in staged broadcasts, travelling shows, and films meant to stir loyalty. Their tools were mimicry, voice control, and mastery of posture, all cultivated to an almost inhuman degree. One figure stood out among them, Tadashi Iwamoto, a kabuki performer infamous for portraying imperial characters with such realism that audiences were warned not to bow. Arrested in 1943 for impersonating a royal aide near the outskirts of Tokyo, Iwamoto was interrogated and sent to a classified holding facility. But in 1946, amid occupation confusion, he was released. No trial, no trace. His files, redacted. His photos, misfiled. All except one, a surveillance image allegedly taken months later, showing Iwamoto entering a small Tokyo theatre through a side door, a theatre now known to have been used by scap cultural officials. Kabuki training demands absolute control of the body, the timing of a breath, the slope of a bow, the flicker of an eyelid. The exact skills needed to impersonate a man who once ruled as a living god and who, after Japan's surrender, could no longer afford to be divine. Enter the theory of Project Kagemusha, or Shadow Warrior. Allegedly a US-led initiative to maintain Japan's imperial image using culturally embedded forms of mimicry. Though no official admission exists, researchers uncovered a 1947 document referencing an imperial continuity operation in which symbolic doubles were deemed preferable to potentially uncooperative originals. The language is clinical, but the implications explosive. Consider the behavioral anomalies. From 1946 onward, Hirohito rarely made unscripted remarks. Witnesses say he hesitated before answering even basic questions, as if translating them silently. His ceremonial movements became stiffer, less fluid than in earlier footage, and his voice, per turn, once commanding in private meetings, took on an oddly theatrical cadence. One interpreter noted, "He paused like an actor waiting for applause that never came." Supporters argue this was trauma or the weight of guilt. Skeptics, however, point to one detail that defies easy explanation: his ears. A 1940 medical sketch of Hirohito in full profile, archived by his personal physician, shows a distinct right earlobe fold, sharp and inward pointing, but every image from 1946 onwards shows the fold blunted. Subtle, but consistent. An ear shape, unlike facial expression, is notoriously difficult to disguise. Could surgery account for the change? Possibly, but what if it didn't? Could a kabuki-trained double have been inserted to shield the emperor, or to replace him entirely? We return again to Tadashi Iwamoto. Those who knew him before his arrest called him a chameleon. He reportedly memorized royal mannerisms down to the timing of Hirohito's habitual cough. One fellow actor claimed, "He became the emperor in front of us. He made us bow." So, if a swap occurred, when and where? One candidate moment is the August 15, 1945 surrender broadcast. Hirohito's voice in stiff formal Japanese was pre-recorded, not broadcast live. Several radio technicians later said they never saw the emperor, only a reel. One even alleged, the voice was hollow, it echoed, like someone imitating divinity. If a double recorded the speech and the real Hirohito was already removed, where did he go? Some believe he was sequestered in a secure facility to protect him from retribution. Others argue he died, either by suicide or silencing. But without evidence, these remain shadows. And so, the kabuki curtain hangs heavy. In a culture where performance and identity are fluid and where illusion can be sacred, the possibility of a manufactured monarch is no longer absurd, but chillingly plausible. The double, if he existed, did not just play a part. He became the part for over 4 decades. One of the most persistent threads in the body swap theory lies in visual evidence, or rather, the interpretation of it. Skeptics and amateur analysts have long noted what they call incongruities between Emperor Hirohito's wartime appearance and his post-war public persona. Before 1945, he's shown as a stiff, militarized figure, rigid spine, narrow gaze, chin upturned. After the war, he emerges softer, more passive, even awkward in mannerisms. His voice in recordings too seems higher, his stride slower. To most, these are just signs of aging, stress, or the weight of national guilt. But to conspiracy theorists, these changes are clues, hints of substitution. Some point to Allied intelligence rumors suggesting the real Hirohito may have been killed in a secret bombing raid in 1945 or taken into custody for interrogation and never released. The man returned to the throne, they argue, may have been a hand-picked lookalike groomed to preserve Japan's imperial continuity during US occupation. Facial recognition software, when applied to historical images, yields conflicting results. While most forensic experts dismiss the differences as natural variants due to time, lighting, and photographic quality, a few anomalies remain unexplained. A subtle asymmetry in the jaw, a crease above the brow absent before 1945. One analysis even suggests the ears don't match, a detail often used in modern forensics to identify individuals. But beyond biology lies psychology. People began noticing not what Hirohito looked like, but what he didn't seem to be anymore. The aloof divinity was gone. In his place stood a quiet, almost ghostly presence, someone who no longer wielded power but simply inhabited a role. If there was a double, he wasn't merely a man performing for the camera. He was Japan's greatest actor, installed to carry the weight of defeat without question. As absurd as the theory may seem, its longevity reveals something deeper, a national reluctance to fully reconcile the emperor's wartime role. By imagining a substitute, the conspiracy gives the public a loophole, an escape hatch from responsibility wrapped in plausible denial. To understand why a body double theory persists, we have to look at the power vacuum of 1945. Japan lay in ruins, its cities firebombed, its people disoriented, its military shattered. Into that void stepped the supreme commander of the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur. To rebuild Japan without chaos, he needed one thing above all: continuity. And the emperor, the so-called living god, was the linchpin of national identity. Official US records show that MacArthur opposed prosecuting Emperor Hirohito for war crimes. He believed removing the emperor would shatter the nation's psyche and unleash resistance. But behind closed doors, Allied psychological operations, specifically those tied to Project Bluebird and early cognitive warfare experiments, were already exploring ways to manipulate national symbols for pacification. Some declassified memos mention hypothetical use of mirrored personas or adaptive behavioral templates for stabilizing regions in the aftermath of occupation. Though none mention Hirohito by name, the eerie language, manufactured humility, substituted continuity, has drawn intense scrutiny from theorists. Could a compliant figure have been installed to play the part of emperor while the real man was interrogated, neutralized, or removed from public view entirely? Eyewitnesses from the Imperial household were never questioned publicly. The only narratives that survived were carefully managed, and curiously, no photographs or direct recordings of Hirohito exist between August 15, 1945, when he surrendered Japan via radio, and several months later when he reappeared in public. That gap, to some, is the window where the switch could have occurred. It sounds like science fiction, but in the high-stakes chess game of post-war geopolitics, image manipulation, doubles, and deception weren't just strategies, they were protocols. The emperor re-emerged in January 1946 with an astonishing proclamation. He was not divine. His voice, previously thought too sacred to be heard, reached the ears of his subjects for the second time ever. The words were plain, the tone was robotic, and to many listeners, something felt off. Rumours spread quickly in Tokyo and Osaka, especially among war veterans and old aristocrats. The man who now bowed deeply, who toured rubble-strewn cities in a suit instead of imperial robes, he didn't resemble the fierce, elusive figure once revered from afar. Some whispered that the wartime emperor had fled, died, or been quietly imprisoned by the Allies. Others claimed that this new Hirohito had a softer jawline, walked with a different gait, and spoke in a dialect slightly foreign to court speech. In the 1980s, amateur facial analysts and conspiracy theorists began publishing comparisons between wartime and post-war photographs. Some pointed to changes in earlobe attachment or the curvature of the nose. A twin thousand facial recognition experiment run by a private university, though never peer-reviewed, found an 89% match, not 100%. It wasn't proof of a double, but it left just enough uncertainty to keep the theory alive. Meanwhile, US records suggest the presence of a cultural continuity asset embedded in the Japanese monarchy between 1945 and 1950. The term remains undefined in the files, but what does that mean? Was it a psychological program, a staged identity, or something more literal? And for those raised in Imperial Japan, the dissonance was emotional. One elderly survivor, interviewed decades later, said, "We worshipped a god. What came back was a man pretending to be one who had forgotten how." General Douglas MacArthur once said he kept Hirohito on the throne to preserve stability. But what if he preserved something else entirely? The photo of MacArthur towering casually beside the emperor in 1945 became iconic. But to many Japanese it was unsettling. Their living deity now looked small, fragile, even replaceable. This moment fed a quiet storm. Declassified US intelligence documents from the early occupation reference a strategy called continuity by illusion. Historians believe this involved carefully maintaining the perception of an unbroken monarchy while shifting power to the new democratic order. The question lingers, did that illusion go beyond mere symbolism? Japanese archives during the same period are mysteriously empty, especially records between August and December 1945. That 4-month blackout is when some believe the swap occurred. According to one persistent rumour, Hirohito had fallen gravely ill, or worse, and a distant cousin or trained actor was brought in to assume the role, coached in court rituals, speech patterns, and public mannerisms. Curiously, US interrogators at the Tokyo trials pursued every high-ranking general and minister. But Hirohito was never once summoned to testify. Not once. Was this because they feared destabilizing the country, or because the man sitting in the palace was no longer the man who signed wartime decrees? In Hiroshima, survivors swore they'd seen the emperor on foot days after surrender, comforting civilians in ways that did not match his known location. In Kyoto, a temple diary mentions the wrong emperor's voice echoing through a radio. Conspiracy or not, something shifted after the war, not just politically but spiritually. The unbroken mirror of the chrysanthemum throne cracked, and no one dared say what had changed. What does a voice remember? In 1945, millions of Japanese heard Emperor Hirohito's voice for the first time as he announced Japan's surrender. The dual voice broadcast, as it became known, was strangely distant and formal, using archaic court language that few citizens fully understood. But when audio engineers compared that voice to earlier wartime recordings made for internal imperial use, they noticed something off. Pitch shifts, changes in sibilance, a flattening of cadence. Linguists concluded the 1945 voice sounded trained, not natural, a deliberate mimicry of court dialect, memorized rather than lived. Further comparisons with post-war Hirohito speeches showed an evolution. His voice became more animated, almost nervous at times. His pre-war tone, by contrast, was unwavering, detached, even cold. Skeptics argue the change was psychological, the trauma of war, surrender, and the stripping of his divine status. But others suspect this was a second man, still mastering his role. Physical discrepancies added fuel to the theory. Facial recognition experts using AI-enhanced photos from before and after the war noticed minute shifts, the curve of the chin, the spacing of the eyes, a thinner left earlobe. It's possible these were effects of age, stress, or even lighting, but to believers they're evidence. In Japanese traditional theatre, especially in No, performers wear masks not to hide, but to reveal layers of meaning. The audience knows the mask is not the man, but the illusion is powerful. Was the post-war emperor merely a mask, worn for the survival of a nation unwilling to face the void left by a fallen god? Rumours persisted, even among the occupying forces. In the years immediately following Japan's surrender, the US intelligence community was not merely rebuilding a defeated country, it was investigating it. Declassified OSS reports from 1946 mention an unusual code name, Operation Black Chrysanthemum. Its files, heavily redacted, refer to the continued viability of the Imperial image and counterintelligence concerns over doubles. What did this mean? Some interpretations suggest US authorities suspected, or perhaps facilitated, the use of a lookalike to stabilize Japan. The theory posits that the original emperor, mentally or physically broken by the bombings and surrender, was replaced by a chosen proxy. This double would act as a controlled mouthpiece for the new democratic narrative, keeping Japan's reverence for the emperor intact while ensuring obedience to the new American-backed order. A mysterious photo surfaced in 1971, reportedly from a private collection in Kyoto. It shows two nearly identical men, both wearing ceremonial court dress. Neither is smiling. Their posture is stiff, but what rattled researchers were the slight variations. One's hair parted left, the other right, the medals on one chest slightly higher. The photo was never authenticated, and then it disappeared. For those who believe, this wasn't just damage control, it was psychological warfare. The US needed a myth to hold Japan together, and the best myth was a living emperor, even if he wasn't the original. The 1946 Humanity Declaration was a moment meant to break with the past. Emperor Showa, once considered divine, renounced his godhood. But to some listeners, something felt off. He spoke carefully, his tone subdued. Gone was the commanding presence remembered from pre-war speeches. One Western journalist even remarked he sounded like a man being ventriloquized. To skeptics, this was not just rhetorical change, it was physical substitution. Experts who examined old and new footage pointed out differences in facial tension, height, even walking gait. Was this the same man who had led Japan into war? Or a carefully groomed double, schooled in the right gestures, fed the right lines? A diary page later attributed to a palace servant now archived under a pseudonym reads, "The man today speaks less. He walks like a shadow. Only the dogs hesitate when he enters and commands." Such cryptic notes only deepen the suspicion. Some even speculated that General MacArthur's famous photo with the Emperor wasn't a moment of mutual respect. It was a staged image with a stand-in, crafted to legitimize American authority through a symbolic handshake with the Emperor. In the age of deepfakes, this theory might seem mundane, but in the analog fog of 1940s Japan, image was everything. If a double could maintain national stability, would it not be seen not as deception, but as duty? By 1947, Japan was transforming, from ashes to neon, from imperial pride to pacifist reform. But some wondered, how did the nation change so quickly and so quietly? The answer, according to believers in the body swap theory, was simple. They had already changed the one person who embodied the soul of the nation. Rumours allege that during the final days of the war, Emperor Showa's inner circle met with Allied intelligence behind closed doors. With surrender inevitable, a bargain was struck. In exchange for sparing the monarchy, a substitution could occur. The original emperor, potentially unstable or unwilling to relinquish divinity, would be replaced by a more malleable counterpart, one trained in silence, ceremony, and Western diplomacy. While this sounds fantastical, a declassified intelligence memo from 1946, buried under layers of vague phrasing, mentions continuity of symbolic leadership under controlled identity. No names, no signatures, just intent. The post-war emperor's sudden docility, his emotional distance, and his rehearsed media appearances all seemed too curated. And then there were the inconsistencies, photographic misalignments, a slight left-handedness in later footage, and once an interpreter reportedly confused by the emperor's dialect shift in private conversation. Was it simply the weight of trauma, the cost of survival, or was it the calm performance of someone who knew he was never meant to wear the crown, but did so because history required a ghost to steady the living? In the end, perhaps the truth about the emperor's double is less about substitution than symbolism. Whether or not a body swap occurred, the conspiracy speaks to Japan's deeper conflict with its own reflection, the need to honor without confronting, to remember without unraveling. If there were two emperors, one of war and one of peace, then Japan was spared the agony of reconciling both in one man. The narrative fractures cleanly, a villain quietly replaced by a figurehead, allowing the nation to move forward without looking too far back. But truth rarely cooperates with comfort. The archives remain sealed. The testimonies grow quieter each year. Still, the questions linger like incense in a closed room. Was the man who renounced divinity in 1946 the same man who had called upon the gods for victory just years earlier? We may never know. But in the silence, in the rumors, in the shifting photographs and softened memories, the double still walks, unseen yet never forgotten. Sometimes the most powerful ghost isn't the one who died, it's the one who replaced the living. History is full of shadows, some cast by power, others by fear. And sometimes what we believe to be the truth is just a mask handed down through time. But masks don't stay on forever. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more forbidden histories, lost legacies and unspoken conspiracies. Hit like, share with someone who questions the official story, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe Japan's emperor had a double? Because some answers vanish before they're ever spoken.